Welcome to the fun side of YouTube. This channel is packed with entertaining, creative, and sometimes unexpected content that's guaranteed to keep you smiling. Hit subscribe and let's have some fun together.
The night my husband's investor launch party imploded on the back terrace of a Hilton Head beach house. I was wearing a dress I'd bought for a trip we never took. That detail matters, though I couldn't have explained why at the time. Some things only make sense in retrospect. I want to start at the end, because that's where you need to begin to understand how I got there. Standing in a gravel parking lot at dusk, with an envelope on the passenger's seat, and the sound of someone else's celebration drifting across the water. My attorney had told me to stay home. My sister had offered 3 times to come with me. My son, who is 22 and furious in the way only young men can be when their fathers disappoint them, had wanted to drive me himself. I went alone. That part was important. Before I get into all of it, I want to say something to whoever found this video on a quiet evening when you were looking for someone who understood. If you've ever watched someone you built your whole life around simply choose differently, and then smile about it, this channel exists for you. The Concealed Bonds tells real stories from real people, and if this one resonates, please consider subscribing. It costs you nothing, and it means the next story reaches someone who might need it exactly when they do. Now, let me tell you about 18 years, a business charter, and the one clause my husband never bothered to read. We met at a conference in Charlotte. He was charming in the way that men who've been told they're charming their whole lives tend to be. Easy with a compliment. Good at making you feel like the most important person in the room. I was 22, finishing a marketing degree. Sharp and ambitious in a way I'd spend the next decade slowly sanding down to fit his life. We married quickly. I relocated twice in 5 years for his work. I turned down a director position in New York because he needed me in Savannah. I became the person who organized his business dinners and remembered his clients' birthdays, and quietly kept the whole enterprise of our marriage running while he took credit for the results. I don't say this bitterly. I say it so you understand what 18 years actually looks like from the inside. Not one dramatic betrayal, but 10,000 small surrenders that you barely notice until the morning you look up and realize you've been living in someone else's story. For so long you've forgotten you ever had your own. The signs came about 2 years before the end. He started spending an extra hour getting ready in the mornings. New suits, cufflinks he'd never have picked out himself, a fragrance I didn't recognize. He began coming home late, and then later, and then occasionally not at all, with explanations that were technically plausible and emotionally incoherent. His phone lived face down on every surface. He began calling me by my full name, never the nickname he'd used for 15 years, as if he were gently distancing himself from the intimacy we'd built, preparing for a formality he hadn't yet announced. I noticed. I said nothing. I had learned, over 18 years, that bringing things up directly never worked with him. It only gave him the chance to construct a better story. So I watched. The dinner was on a Thursday in February. He'd made the reservation himself, which should have been my first signal. We hadn't had a reservation-worthy dinner, just the two of us, in almost 3 years. The restaurant was the kind of place with low lighting and a sommelier who hovered unnecessarily. The sort of atmosphere designed to make difficult conversations feel softer than they are. He ordered for both of us without asking. That was something he did when he was nervous. I watched his jaw work around whatever he was rehearsing, and waited. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he said. I had been doing a lot of thinking too, as it happened. 3 weeks earlier, I'd found a lump during a routine self-exam, and spent the following days in that particular suspension that happens when your body offers you a threat you're not yet sure is real. I'd gone to the imaging center alone, waited alone, been told the results were inconclusive and required a follow-up biopsy, and scheduled that follow-up alone, all while maintaining the full calendar of social obligations and household management that kept his life running smoothly. I tried to tell him the night before the biopsy. He'd been on a call in the home office and waved me off with one hand without looking up. The follow-up had come back benign that morning. I'd sat in my car in the Medical Plaza parking lot and cried with my forehead against the steering wheel. Then I'd driven home and started dinner. Now here he was, doing a lot of thinking. I need more space than this marriage allows, he said. I've been unhappy for some time. I think the kindest thing for both of us is to acknowledge that and move forward separately. There was more, there always is. The rehearsed language of a man who'd consulted his exit before consulting his wife. Phrases like, "We've grown in different directions, and I respect you too much to keep pretending," that had all the emotional weight of a corporate press release. I let him finish. My hands were folded in my lap. My face was doing something neutral and contained that seemed to unsettle him more than tears would have. "Is there someone else?" I asked. The pause was 2 seconds too long. Her name was Dana. She was his business partner on a hotel development project he'd been cultivating for the past year, the one that had required so many late nights, so many weekend calls. Her family had old money in real estate, which made her useful in a way I hadn't been for a long time. He was careful to describe how they'd tried to keep things professional, how one thing had led to another, how he hoped I'd understand. I nodded. I asked for the check. I drove home alone. The divorce papers arrived 8 days later. My sister told me to fight. My son called from his apartment in Raleigh and said things about his father that I won't repeat here, but that I have stored carefully in my heart. I thanked them both and told them I needed a moment to process. What I actually needed was 3 days alone with the documentation I'd quietly begun gathering. Bank records, calendar inconsistencies, 3 months of careful notes about dates and times, and things that didn't add up. I'm a marketing professional. The core of that work is pattern recognition. I had recognized this pattern very clearly. I signed the divorce papers with a steady hand and sent them back without a counteroffer. My husband told mutual friends I'd taken it remarkably well, which he meant as evidence of my emotional detachment. He was right about the detachment. He was wrong about the reason for it. The week after I returned the papers, I called my father-in-law. He is a man who built a construction company from 3 employees and a salvage truck into a regional firm worth $40 million. He is 76 years old. He attended every one of my son's birthdays, every school play, every graduation. When I lost my mother 8 years ago, he was the one who sat with me in the hospital the last night, because my husband had a work trip he hadn't been able to move. He answered on the second ring and said, "I wondered when you'd call." We met for lunch at the diner near his house on a Tuesday. He ordered the same thing he always orders: 2 eggs, wheat toast, black coffee, and looked at me across the table with an expression I recognized as grief. "I owe you an apology," he said, "and an explanation." He told me about the clause he'd had added to the company's founding articles 8 years earlier. He'd done it quietly, through his personal attorney, without telling my husband. His reasoning was not complicated. He had watched his son treat me with an escalating carelessness that he recognized from his own father's patterns, and he had decided to do what his grandfather had not thought to do. He built a consequence into the structure. The clause was specific. If the majority shareholder initiated divorce proceedings against his spouse without documented evidence of the spouse's infidelity, his 60% controlling stake transferred automatically to a family trust. The trust was managed by my father-in-law during his lifetime and passed to an independent trustee upon his death. "Your husband has never read the founding articles," my father-in-law said, buttering his toast with great deliberateness. "I've mentioned them to him twice over the years." He nodded both times the way people do when they've already decided something isn't worth their attention. I sat with that for a moment. "Does he know about the clause?" I asked. "No." "When would he find out?" "When his attorney files the divorce with the court." He paused. "Or sooner, if you decided to tell him." I decided not to tell him. The months that followed were quieter than I expected. My attorney, a woman my son-in-law professor had recommended, was thorough and unhurried. She obtained a certified copy of the founding articles through the company's registered agent and had it authenticated. She told me what we had was sound, and that I should wait for the moment of maximum relevance. In the meantime I lived. It sounds simple, it was not. I walked away from the house I had designed and renovated and maintained without contesting it, because it no longer felt like mine. I found an apartment I liked. I called an old colleague from my corporate days, a woman who'd made VP at a regional firm, while I'd been reorganizing my life around someone else's ambitions. And we had coffee. By the end of February, I had a job offer, a real one. Senior Director of Brand Strategy, the kind of role I would have had a decade earlier if I hadn't spent that decade redirecting my energy elsewhere. My son drove down from Raleigh in March and spent a weekend helping me hang curtains and assemble furniture. He didn't say much about his father. He said a great deal about me. That I was stronger than I knew. That I had always been the one who kept everything together. That he hoped I understood the difference between what I'd lost and what I'd given away. I did know the difference. I was starting to live inside it. The Instagram post went up on a Saturday in early April. My husband and Dana, standing in front of the family beach house in Hilton Head. The one his father had bought in 1987. The one where we'd spent 15 summers. The one where my son had learned to swim. The caption announced an investor launch event to be held there in 3 weeks. The official kickoff of their hotel development project. In one photo, Dana's hand rested on my husband's arm with the ease of someone who had already begun thinking of things as hers. In another photo, taken from a slightly different angle, I recognized the ring she was wearing, an oval stone in an antique setting. It had belonged to my grandmother. My husband had given it to Dana. My attorney added that to the documentation without me having to ask. My father-in-law called that evening. He'd seen the photos. He told me he would travel to Hilton Head the morning after the investor launch, and that his attorney would deliver the official notification letter to the beach house that same morning. Timing matters in construction, he said. Apparently it matters in everything else too. I spent the following 3 weeks preparing with the focus I usually reserve for campaign launches. I chose what I'd wear. A dove gray dress, understated and well-made, the kind of thing that says I didn't need to try very hard. I rehearsed the tone I wanted, not triumphant, not wounded, simply matter of fact. A woman delivering information, not a grievance. My son offered again to come. I told him the same thing I'd told my sister, that this part I needed to do alone. The drive from Savannah to Hilton Head takes about an hour and a half. I drove it in the late afternoon of a Friday in late April with the windows down, and a certified copy of the founding articles in a sealed envelope on the passenger seat. My father-in-law had sent a text that morning. He's expecting 40 investors. Dana's family will be there. Be well, my girl. I pulled into the property just before 6. The gate was open, the driveway lined with cars. The house was lit from within and without. String lights strung along the upper deck. A catering truck parked to the side. I could hear music, something jazzy and aspirational, the kind of soundtrack that announces ambition without specifying exactly what it's ambitious about. I sat for a moment with my hands on the wheel and looked at the ocean. The woman in the rearview mirror looked fine. She'd had a biopsy alone and been back at her desk the following Monday. She'd signed 18 years away with a steady hand and started over at 40 without asking anyone's permission. She was fine. I gathered the envelope, got out of the car, and walked toward the house. The back terrace was where most of the gathering had arranged itself. Round tables with white linens, a bar set up near the railing, a small podium with a projection screen showing architectural renderings of a hotel I recognized in filings Dana's family firm had made with the county. 35 people, maybe. All wearing the kind of clothes that announce serious money without appearing to try. I recognized several of my husband's longtime business contacts. Men I had, seated at dinner tables and whose wives' names I had remembered for years on their behalf. They saw me before he did. I watched the recognition travel through the terrace like a current. My husband turned from a conversation near the podium and went very still. "This is unexpected," he said. "I won't take up much of your evening," I said. "I just have something to deliver in person." Dana materialized at his side with practiced precision. She was taller than I'd expected. Elegant in a way that was clearly effortful, and the expression she arranged said she had decided to be gracious. She did not stay gracious for long. I opened the envelope and removed the notarized document, 4 pages, company seal, 2 attorneys' signatures, and held it where both of them could see it. "This is the founding charter for my husband's company," I said. His father had it amended 8 years ago. There's a clause beginning on page 3 that I thought you both deserved to before your attorneys learned about it through the court filing. My husband said, "What are you talking about?" It wasn't a question. I read the relevant section aloud. My voice was steady. The terrace had gone quiet in the particular way that happens when people understand they are witnessing something they were not supposed to witness. Dana took the document from me before I'd finished. Her eyes moved fast across the page, and I watched the color change in her face as she reached the operative language. "This voids your stake," she said, looking at my husband. Her voice had gone flat and controlled the way voices do when someone is doing very fast financial calculations. "It says it already transferred. The moment you filed." "That can't be right," he said. "My attorney confirmed it this morning," I said. "The transfer was automatic upon execution of the filing." A heavy-set man in a linen blazer, someone I'd served salmon to at a dinner party 3 years ago, stepped closer with his phone already to his ear. He looked at my husband with an expression that was not friendly. "Your stake is what you listed as your share of the project collateral," he said, not loudly, but in the way that carries. The silence that followed was remarkable in its completeness. Dana threw the document at my husband. It scattered across the terrace boards. Then she turned to him and said, in a voice the entire terrace could hear with great clarity, that he had promised her. The business was solid. That he had guaranteed her family's investment was secured. That she had put her family's money and her name, and her professional reputation behind a partnership, built on an asset he had apparently never verified he actually owned. He said her name. She said things I won't repeat here. Her final sentence, delivered at a volume that sent a pair of pelicans off the railing, was that if his controlling stake was gone, so was she. She walked inside and did not come back out. I picked up the document from the terrace boards, straightened the pages and returned them to the envelope. I looked at my husband. He looked like a man standing in a building he'd assumed was load-bearing, but had never thought to check. "There's one more thing," I said. "My grandmother's ring. The oval stone in the antique setting. It belongs to my family. I expect my attorney to receive written confirmation by Monday that it will be returned." He nodded. He did not speak. I walked back through the terrace and past the catering staff and out to the parking lot. Behind me, I heard the gathering fracture. Voices overlapping. Someone calling for attention, the particular sound of a professional event becoming something else entirely. I drove to the inn I'd booked on the island and sat on the small balcony, looking at the water for a long time. I had expected something clean and decisive, the sensation of a chapter closing. What I felt instead was more complicated. A deep tiredness, some residual grief, and underneath it, unexpectedly, something like air. The particular feeling of a held breath finally released. My father-in-law arrived at the beach house the following morning as promised. He called me from the driveway. "The attorney delivered the notification," he said. "Your husband was there when it arrived." He sat down on the porch steps. "Dana's family has already engaged a litigation firm." I thanked him. He was quiet for a moment. "You handled yourself exactly right," he said. "Your grandmother would have approved." I drove home to Savannah the long way, through the low country. My son called somewhere around Beaufort, and I put him on speaker. And we talked about nothing important for 45 minutes. It was one of the best conversations of my year. My husband called 2 days later. He sounded like a man who'd spent 48 hours making very difficult phone calls. He asked if we could meet. We sat at a coffee place near his temporary apartment. He looked tired and somehow smaller than I remembered, the way people do when the performance they've been maintaining runs out of fuel. He told me Dana's family had withdrawn from the project. His remaining business partners were reassessing. The company's board, led by his father, had installed an interim manager, while the ownership transfer was formalized. "You cost me everything," he said. "You made your choices," I said. "The clause existed before I knew about it. The consequences were built into decisions you made." He was quiet for a moment. "Did you know?" he asked. "When you signed the papers, did you already know?" "I knew when I called your father," I said. "Which was after you filed." He arbsed. this. Why didn't you tell me? I wrapped my hands around my coffee cup. Because you assumed I'd take whatever you offered and be grateful for the clean exit. You have spent 18 years assuming that. A long silence. I had a health scare, I said. Right before you told me you needed space. I spent 3 weeks going to imaging appointments alone and waiting for biopsy results alone. And I tried to tell you the night before the follow-up. You waved me off without looking up from your phone. I kept my voice level. It was benign. But that's not the point. He didn't say anything. There was nothing adequate to say. I finished my coffee and stood up. I hope you find what you were looking for, I said. And I meant it, not generously exactly, but honestly. He had a great deal to rebuild now, and whatever he built next was entirely his own concern. My grandmother's ring arrived by courier the following Thursday. Insured and documented, with a formal letter of return from his attorney. I put it on my right hand and wore it to my first day at my new office. The next several months moved quickly. I was busy in the way I'd forgotten I could be. Productively, purposefully, for my own sake, rather than as an extension of someone else's ambition. My son visited every few weeks. My father-in-law and I kept our Thursday lunches at the same diner, same table. Same easy rhythm of two people who have known each other long enough to skip the surface conversation. I stopped coloring my hair in June. I'd been covering the silver since my mid-30s, the way I'd been covering a lot of things. Making myself easier to look at, more acceptable, less of an inconvenience. The silver had come in beautifully, as it turned out. A colleague stopped me in the hallway my second week back to ask who did my highlights. In the fall, I drove up to Hilton Head on a quiet weekend and walked along the beach below what had been the family's beach house. It was on the market by then. My father-in-law had made that decisions with characteristic clarity. Too many summers that meant different things to different people now. Too much complicated feeling attached to the walls. I stood at the water's edge and watched the pelicans work the shallows. It occurred to me that I had spent the better part of 2 decades making myself smaller to fit inside a life I'd had no part in designing, and that the life I was building now, imperfect, uncertain, entirely my own, was larger than anything I'd had before. I drove back to Savannah in the early evening, with the windows down and the radio on, and my grandmother's ring, catching the last of the light on my right hand. 18 years is a long time to give someone. It is not, as it turns out, too long to recover from.